We are looking at Hebrews chapter 11. We have been considering that very important idea of faith. What kind of faith do I need to have in order to know I'm going to go to heaven? What kind of faith do I really need to have? Hebrews chapter 11, we'll be looking at, this might surprise you, I'm not doing just one verse this morning. 32 through 35, the beginning of verse 35. And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouth of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back the dead by resurrection. Now, the other half of this we'll be looking at next week, what we need to do to show faith when things aren't really working out how we would want them to work out. But this morning we're going to look at the idea of ordinary people doing great things. Now, kind of by way of just my introduction, it reminded me of when I finally graduated from Talbot after being there for 7 years. I was there longer than some of the profs because I just kept taking electives. I just loved studying the Old Testament, and I kind of had to graduate because I ran out of the electives. I'd already taken them, and of course you can't take them twice. And so I had to take the required classes finally. And of course, when you're in seminary like that, you might be in classes with people who are involved in church already, who are going onto the mission field, who are involved in ministry. And I wasn't really. I was occasionally teaching Sunday school at the church we attended. And I remember I finally did all of the classes and I satisfied all the requirements and I had to graduate. And got the cap and gown on, and we were assembling there in front of the Biola Library, and I just was thinking, I'm not sure I belong here. This is a fairly important, accomplishment, but I'm not like these people. It still makes me feel a little out of place. Or I thought of the idea of receiving a teaching credential, which was even funnier. I resisted doing the teaching route, even though my mother had suggested that to me. I kind of had an academic mind, an intellectual mind. I kind of found science interesting. I was working in a warehouse, and one of the other guys had mentioned that he was substitute teaching, and he just looked at me and he said, "I don't know why you don't do that." Here I was working in a warehouse with guys who hadn't even gone through high school, and I already had a master's degree. But I was okay with that. God wasn't, but I was. And kind of fell backwards into teaching. That's not what I wanted to do my whole life. I was amazed when I get around people who say, "I always wanted to be a teacher." Really? Because I didn't. It just was something I found I could do real easy and started taking the classes, and next thing I knew, I remember getting that notification in the mail that I'd satisfied all the requirements, and here was my single subject credential, and I just thought, wow. I managed to jump through all the hoops. You've heard Dutchie talk about jumping through all of the hoops, and it's not so much that you do a superhuman kind of accomplishment as it's just I finally managed to satisfy all the bureaucracy. Perhaps more to the point was when I became a pastor. Now, I had started to go back to Golden Gate to get a THM because I had taken so many electives at Talbot. I kind of wanted the record to be reflective of all the classes I'd taken. And we had gone to a particular church because as a Southern Baptist, you get a really nice discount at the seminary. It was a financial choice. And I'm sitting in the pew, and this guy that was leading the church actually was an electrical contractor. He had no training. I don't know why he was there, but I remember sitting in the pew going, I don't know what he's doing because I don't think he knows what he's doing. And I'm not a real pastor kind of guy, but with all my background and training, I think I could do better than this. I'm going to be honest. I wasn't thinking this is an opportunity for me to do great things for God's kingdom. That's not what I was thinking. I was just thinking, wow, I'm kind of in a position where I obviously have the education. I obviously have the background. I could do better than this. I guess that's what God wants me to do. Now that's how I got into the ministry. It wasn't angels coming to my bed at night. It wasn't this driving desire. My wife would tell you I'm probably not really much of a pastoral person. I'm much more intellectual and academic. I love reading the books. And kind of the same thing here. Well, yeah, with my background and experience and ability to explain Scripture, why wouldn't I do this? But I'm not a real example, a Chuck Swindoll, a pastoral example for everybody. What do you think of when it's just an ordinary person who finds themselves in a position where they're actually accomplishing something notable? Or the Almighty has put them in a position where His will is going to be accomplished in their life, but they're just like you and I. Now, that's important because for the past several weeks, we've been looking at examples of faith. What does it take to know that I have legitimate faith before God's throne? That I'm going to be saved? And you remember, we were looking at, well, the pillars of faith. Abel's sacrifice, where the rabbis say fire came down. And that didn't happen for his brother Cain. But Abel had some sort of an idea of how holy God was, and he just gave a really impressive sacrifice. And we were thinking about how uncomfortable that may make us feel, and how often we make an uncomfortable sacrifice that shows our awareness of who God is. Of Enoch, who didn't show up for dinner. And not like me, because I'm out wandering around doing other things. People just said, well, obviously God took him because he is so righteous. Or Noah, who, despite slander and ridicule for decades after decades, building an ark that no one had seen any possible use. Or Abraham, leaving a very successful career and going into the wilderness, or even believing God of having a child. Well, all of these examples probably make you and I feel safe, or at least wondering, well, I'm not a man of faith like that. I would never compare myself to Abraham or Noah or someone like that. How do I have faith then? How do I know I'm going to be okay before God's throne when I die? Well, this week we are looking at some real encouragement. I have to tell you, what we're looking at this morning, I found very encouraging this week. We are looking at some very interesting examples of what it means to have faith. We start in verse 32 with the writer to Hebrews saying, now, what more shall I say? For time would fail me. This is his way of saying, look, I've got to wrap things up. I can't keep going into all details after detail after detail. We're going to be here way too long. Something some of you may have thought of on Sunday mornings when you say, Pastor, you got to speed things up. But he's getting to the point where he's saying, look, I've given you so many examples. I can't keep giving you all these examples. This is a letter meant to be read in one sitting. We got to get to the point. And you think, okay, you've been kind of going through the history of Israel. Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Moses. Well, now he gets to the time of the judges. And if you've been in Sid's Sunday school class and you've looked at the book of Judges, you might immediately think, wait a minute, I'm not so sure I know of any stellar example of faith in the book of Judges. The time of the Judges. Israel had come into the promised land. Joshua has died. They are surrounded by nations that they didn't conquer. And they begin to give in to the temptation and just kind of joining with their neighbors and not remaining faithful. It was a time where every man did what was right in his own eyes. That's how the book of Judges opens. That's how the book of Judges closes. It was a time when everyone just did what they thought was right. There was no organized central government, and there was no organized central kind of religion. It was a time where there's a regular repeating pattern. The people have left the Lord, they've worshiping idols, that's apostasy. They no longer are following their instructions that they received from Moses. The Lord has brought judgment upon them. They cry out, and after repentance, the Lord responds and gives them a deliverer. That's what the book of Judges is. This cycle. Being disobedient, the Lord punishes them. He provides a deliverer over and over again. And so the big question that we see in the book of Judges, and the question that the writer to Hebrews would have us ask this morning is, you need an example of, do you remain faithful when everyone around you is different? Are you going to remain faithful when people make fun of you or want to perhaps even persecute you? Or do you just give in and kind of join with everybody else? Are you going to be faithful, or do you assimilate? Okay, that's a good question. What kind of examples can you give me? Well, he doesn't go in chronological order, but he begins to give us reference to these judges from the book of Judges. Now, the book of Judges is kind of a book for young boys. There's a lot of swords. There's a lot of battles, people getting sliced up. It's an exciting book. But it's also kind of a sobering book. The people of Israel kept disobeying the Almighty, being punished, and had to be delivered. I think these go in order from sort of the most acceptable to sort of the most questionable. These are going in order from, okay, this might be an example, to what was this guy thinking? The first example, Gideon. I find it fascinating that recently they discovered some broken pottery right in the area where Gideon lived that has his name on the pottery that's roughly from about the age when Gideon would have lived. Isn't that exciting? Because if you read the experts, quote unquote, they'll tell you this is all made up. Really? Why would there be pottery smashed with his name on it? Right where he lived. And remember this whole story about smashing pottery with torches inside. Well, you might know the story. It's all the way back in Judges chapter 6. So much of this is so fun and interesting to read. Gideon is hiding inside a wine press because the raiders keep coming down and stealing the food that the people need. And as he's hiding inside a wine press, trying to just process some grain so that they can have food, the Midians are oppressing Israel. Verse 11, now an angel of the Lord came and sat under the terebinth at Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, the son of Gideon, was beating out the wheat in the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, the Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor. Mighty man of valor. He's hiding in a winepress. That's hardly an act of bravery. And Gideon is so brave, he says, really, prove this to me. Prove that you're really from the Lord. And we have that whole, even in our way, our culture of putting out a fleece. I need the Lord to prove this to me. Isn't that amazing? An angel comes to you and gives you a message, and you say, well, can you prove it? Well, yeah, Gideon has an appointment with the enemy. Now, if you were Gideon and you're going to go face this mighty army, you would say, well, I need to give a pep talk. We need to get as many men as we can. And you know the story. There was a winnowing process. All the men gathered together. And they began to select who could go out to battle and who couldn't. And it gets down to how you drink water out of the stream. And everyone who just put their face in the water and took in the water, you get to go home. Everyone who laps like a dog, you get to go out to battle. Now, I don't think that was because these guys are better. They could maybe see the reflection in the water of someone sneaking up behind. I think it was a way for the Almighty to show Gideon, you're going to go out to battle in a way that you can't possibly think you had any way of winning. You're going to have to admit this came from my hand. Okay, Lord, I'm going to go out with an impossibly few number of people. Okay, not only that, don't even go out with a sword. Go out with torches inside pottery. Now, if you were Gideon, you might think, I'm willing to be your soldier. I'm willing to go out and fight for Israel. But can I at least carry a sword? No. Would you have done that? Would you have said, I'm willing to go out and battle for you, Lord? Because, in Ephesians, we're told that we're not battling against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and kingdoms and dominion. You're involved in a battle now, so what do you carry with you? Don't you want the mightiest thing you can have? We're going to go to the enemy with torches inside clay pottery. Would you have done that? Gideon did, and at the direction of the Almighty, the pottery is broken, the torches come out. Of course, the enemy thinks that this means that they are surrounded by a mighty army, and the Lord gives him a victory. Now, why I think Gideon is first on the list is because the people come to him and say, at the end of chapter 8, you've done a great job, let's make you king. And he says, no, I don't want to be king. Let God be your king. Oh, that's good. Then he says, I've got an idea. Take all the gold that you have and give it to me. Well, they do that. And he makes a special prayer thing that he can wear. And that became a snare for the people of Israel. They were looking upon that as what you had to have and worship that. Okay, but what he did for the most part was faithful. And then the example is Barak. Now Barak actually happened first, chapter 4. This happened before Gideon. The people of Israel have done evil in the sight of the Lord. They're worshiping foreign gods, and they're under the oppression of Jabin, the king of Canaan. And Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lepidoth, was judging Israel at this time, and she comes to Barak and says, this is what God wants you to do. I will give you the victory. Go out and fight with this guy. And because he was such a man of faith, he said, well, if you will go with me, I will. But if you don't go with me, I don't want to go. Now, I don't see that as a big position of faith. And the writer to Hebrews doesn't mention Deborah. But, okay, she says, yes, I'll do that, but you're not going to get the credit for this. They go out, and now the rabbis say that there was a huge thunderstorm that came out. And at Deborah's direction, because she probably was praying for this, then they go out and engage with the army who had chariots, but the chariots are getting stuck in the mud. And their enemy, the one that they're chasing, Sisera, gets out of his chariot and he runs away. And he comes to a particular woman and says, hide me. And she says, okay, you know the story. She gives him milk, covers him up with a blanket. He goes to sleep. She takes a tent peg and nails him. Well, Barak didn't get the credit for killing Sisera. That went to a woman. That's an odd person to have as an example of faith. Samson is mentioned. Now, if you're thinking of Samson, you know Samson gets more verses in the book of Judges than any other judge. You realize that? If you're like me, you're thinking of Samson going, whoa, Samson. There's a guy that's hardly an example of faith. Samson, the one who wants to find a girlfriend, a wife who's not from Israel, who's from the enemy. Samson seems like, you know, in our picture in our mind is that he's from professional wrestling, I guess. He probably has long hair, we think, and he's all buffed out. I'm not so sure. Maybe the power of the Lord would be so evident that he looked like an ordinary person with long hair. But what he was doing, chapter after chapter there, 13 through 16, is just some odd things. So you're consorting with the enemy and the Lord gives you a mighty victory. That's kind of an odd example of faith. You're consorting with the enemy and they try to lock you in the city. So you tear out the entire gates and go take them and throw them up the hill. That's an odd one. You've been captured by the enemy because you were bedazzled by Delilah. They cut off your hair and now you're the object of scorn. They've put out your eyes and they're making you for amusement. And isn't this interesting? The only time we have recorded that Samson prayed to God was, hey, give me back my strength so I can push down this temple and kill all these people. That's the only prayer we have of Samson. Now, most people would think, well, how long do you think that happened? How long did it take for all of that to happen? A couple months? 20 years Samson judged Israel. He was judging Israel for a long time. These couldn't be the only things he did, but we think of Samson like, these are some odd examples of faith. Worse, Jephthah, Judges 11 through 12. The Lord gives him a fabulous victory, and he says something just completely inexplicable. Lord, if you give me the victory, the first thing that comes out of my house to greet me, I will sacrifice. Jephthah, what are you thinking? We don't sacrifice people. You might think it's an animal of some kind. I'm a dog person. I'm not a cat person. You would think maybe Jephthah had a cat he didn't like. Okay, the first person who comes out of the house, I'll get rid of that. I didn't want it to begin with anyway. Why would you say such a thing? Who comes out to greet him? His only daughter. And they're still divided on, did he actually sacrifice his daughter? Or was she just some sort of a special person who couldn't get married and he was left without grandchildren and a way to continue his family line? How is that an example of faith? And yet, here's our examples of faith. He went out and trusted the Lord to give him a victory. Continuing there in verse 32, of David. Oh man, we could spend weeks on David. What David do you remember? Do you remember the David who went out against Goliath with just a sling? Didn't even have a sword. Goliath is angry. They're sending a little boy out to battle with me, and David says, no, I'm going to cut off your head with your sword. You think, wow, that is an example of faith. David, who wrestled with the bears and the predators while he was watching the sheep. Well, now there's a David of faith. David, who was fleeing from Saul and remained faithful. Or David and Bathsheba. Is that the David of faith? Samuel, the prophets. And we think of the prophets, many of them, Obadiah, Habakkuk, Nahum. We don't even have any great things that they did. We just have their message that they remained faithful. But verse 33, through faith conquered kingdoms. Well, we heard some of them who through faith conquered kingdoms. Enforced justice, tried to enforce God's laws. Encourage people to be faithful. Obtained promises, not eternal promises, but the promises God had made for them to be in the land and to be secure. Stop the mouths of lions. Was that Samson or Daniel? Quench the power of the fire. We think of, why isn't Daniel mentioned? Such an example of faith. Quench the fire. Are you thinking of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? That's really almost all we have of them. Became strong out of weakness. You mean when Samson again gained his strength, or when some of these examples you've given me who shouldn't have won the battle did? Put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. You mean Elijah and Elisha? Ordinary people who did some very ordinary things, and Samson over 20 years. Here's what the example is. Faced with the impossible, we have people who put their faith in God. Faced with the impossible. You want me to go out and engage the enemy with what? But they've got chariots. And the explanation from the rabbis, it rained and mud kept the chariots from moving around, but still, Gideon assembled the men facing chariots and a much bigger army. That was faith. Marching out with torches inside the pottery, that's all they had. Okay, that could be an example of faith. David going out before Goliath, the giant, that's faith. We have examples over and over again about kind of ordinary people like you and I, who maybe had one moment in their life where they responded in faith. But they were like you and I in almost every other day. Faith when there's no alternative. That counts as great faith. You've gone to the doctor and you get that diagnosis. There's no alternative, but you're going to demonstrate faith. You're facing difficult times. You're facing challenging times. You're facing times that people would tell you, your God is not answering your prayers, but you're going to have faith. That would make you an example of faith, just like these people. We tend to think of people of great faith, we need to be like Moses or Abraham or Noah. Being a person of great faith means I'm looking at an impossible opportunity and I respond with faith because I know I can't do it on my own. An example, your salvation. That's an impossible challenge for you to do on your own. You can't be good enough. You can't put enough money in the plate. You can't do enough good works. At some point you have to say, I have to just come to the Almighty in faith, that Jesus is my righteousness. I can't do this on my own. At some point, at difficult times, we tend to think if we have really done everything right, we shouldn't have difficult times. If we've been really responsible, we shouldn't have difficult times. Yes, a lot of my difficult times have come from my own irresponsibility. Don't talk to my wife about that. She could talk to you for the rest of the day about that. I'm talking about when we face things that this is what's turning out. How do I respond? I respond by trusting God. That doesn't mean that everything in my life is good. That doesn't mean that everything in my life is perfect or I'm not being faithful. That means when things happen, I'm going to respond in faith. Even if there is no choice, even if, well, what else are you going to do? Well, I'm still going to trust God. I'm going to be responsible. You know, next week, you want to be responsible with the budget. But you want to trust God for doing something beyond what you could do on your own. You want to step forward for God. You don't want to be in the position where you say, well, I would trust God, but that's not my gift. I don't know what my gift is, but I know that's not my gift. You know, when the church comes up and asks you, can you help with the 4th of July booth? Well, that's not my gift. You don't want to be a person who says, no, I can't have faith, I'm too old. Yeah, we're all getting older. I don't think there's a magic marker where, oh, you're too old now, don't have to worry about this anymore. No matter where we are in life, no matter what we are facing, no matter how old we are, we get to have a choice whether we respond in faith or not. Here's one that all of us struggle with, because I would rather do my own thing with my own money. Oh, I can't afford that. I can't afford that. I can't afford to put more money in the plate. Really? What are you spending your money on? Well, I don't know if that's the point. Oh, yes, that is. You know, as people who just live here in an affluent country that have all of our desires with all the advertising, we want to live the good life. Oh, I can't afford that. Really? Are you sure? A really uncomfortable question this morning. When was the last time you had to come before the Almighty and say, I can't do this. You have to do it. I'm going to have faith in you. Not because I've done something irresponsible. Because I want to do something good. Not because you want to invest in the latest stock that you think is going to take off. Let's make it really uncomfortable. Next week at the business meeting, you think, I really think we should try to do something to reach this community. It's not in our budget. Let's have faith. When was the last time you've done that? Most of us who've grown up here in America and California, we think, be responsible. Don't depend upon anybody else. Don't put God to the test. But really, when are you going to be in a position where you can say, God, I'm willing to be used. I'm willing to respond in faith. What do you want me to do? Be comfortable? Have an abundance of money? Isn't that what some churches